Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, along with Dane Mizutani of the Pioneer Press, and welcome to our new series called What Happened to That Guy, where we look at players who maybe didn't necessarily meet expectations and the explanations behind what happened in 2023 to those Vikings players. And we're going to start off with running back Alexander Mattison. And Dane, we have to begin last offseason when the Vikings decided to move on from Delvin Cook, and they signed Madison early in the process, making it clear that they believe that he could be RB1. We spent a lot of the offseason wondering, well, who else is he going to be paired with? And the answer was, well, nobody else that was outside of the roster. And the end results were not great. He finished as the second lowest graded starting running back in the NFL by PFF, only 700 yards, 0 touchdowns for Alexander Mattison this year, and a disappointing overall result. What is your top explanation for what happened for Alexander Mattison, who was once promising and was good at filling in for Delvin Cook, but not as good when he was handed the RB1 reins?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that happened to Alexander Mattison is that we just learned he was being asked to punch above his weight class. And we learned that pretty early on. I think Alexander Mattison really did thrive in that role behind Dalvin Cook for 3 or 4 years, where he could come in and just run as hard as he could into a line and hope that a hole opened up and kind of give that change of pace back feel. Normally, your change of pace back is kind of this scat back, smaller guy who can get out into space. In Alexander Madison's case, it was just a brute guy who was going to run hard. And that worked when you had someone like Dalvin Cook in the backfield. But when you try to invert it and make Alexander Mattison that main lead back, we learned pretty early on it just wasn't going to work. And we also learned pretty early on that they just don't have any depth behind them to even really challenge Alexander Mattison. It was like, here's the keys to the car. It's your car. Where no one else is even coming to challenge you for that spot. It's why you saw them bring in Cam Akers over the course of the first month and a half of the season. I think it was pretty apparent early on that this guy is not going to be able to shoulder the load. It's why you saw over time Ty Chandler, and it took way too long for Ty Chandler to overtake him. But it's why people were clamoring for Ty Chandler to overtake him. It's why eventually he did overtake him. It's just because we learned Alexander Mattison is not a lead back in the NFL. And he's a really nice guy, and he tries really hard and he works really hard, but that doesn't equal number one running back, RB1. And I think over and over again, you started to kind of see it play out this season. I thought fumbling was an issue. It actually wasn't that big of an issue. He just fumbled in really bad moments. I think he had 2 lost fumbles this year, but everyone remembers the one in Denver that essentially lost them that game. And so that you had just had a lot of things compounding on top of each other. And each of them kind of said, this guy's being asked to do too much. It was a miscalculation by the front office to think that you could go into this season with him as your lead guy. And there was continuously repeatable offenses that showed that this guy is not it.
I think the biggest thing that surprised me was that he was a non-factor in the receiving game, which where he had been pretty effective out of the backfield at catching passes. And I thought heading into the season that he had pretty good hands. And yet, from a receiving grade perspective, he was the third lowest receiving running back, and he only averaged 6.4 yards per reception and had a number of very shocking drops where the ball
Mm-hmm.
is right in his hands and he turned upfield too quickly and dropped the football. And that made me wonder a little bit on this, Dane, if there was some trying too hard for Alexander Mattison to prove to everyone that he was RB1. I mean, when you get moved up to a position like that, all the fantasy world starts paying attention to you. Reporters like us are asking all the time, hey, now you're RB1. What's going to come next for you? And this was a season with a lot of pressure on him that he could potentially break out and hold down this role for years to come. And I wonder if that was in his head as he was playing, because there were times not only with dropping passes that he normally would not have dropped, but also even with running, where there was a total lack of patience at times. It would seem like he would just run into the back of his offensive lineman. And then I think that skill set plays into it as well. He's always been a bruising, grounded pound type of running back, not somebody who has incredible twitch like we saw from Ty Chandler, or who can scoot through tiny holes, who can, dodge tacklers, run away from defenders. So he just doesn't get explosive runs. And I think that that maybe wasn't factored in much, because we saw Chandler come in and get a couple of 30-yard runs right away. And that was also missing. And if he had that part of his game, I think it would have been a lot more manageable, those other parts of it. But I did wonder about the attention that that decision garnered, especially who he was taking over for, somebody who was one of the great running backs in the league, that's maybe more difficult than we ever factor in.
Yeah, and I think that is a good point. You could kind of see it building over the course of the year where it did feel like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders at times, probably because a lot of his games would be followed by massive criticism, and guys try to stay off social media. I know he was one that really tried to stay off social media, but it really seeps into your life, and it seeps into everyone around you. Uh, because I remember talking to him and he was saying, it's not just me who has to deal with this vitriol online. It's my family. It's everyone. And I think that becomes a lot for people to handle. And then you kind of add in the fact that he continued to struggle on the field with production. So I think you're right that it was probably just a lot for him, almost a case of, I need to be someone I'm not. I know I can't be that person, but I'm going to keep trying to be that person. And he was kind of a ghost in the locker room by the end of the year. Um, these guys are by no means like required to say yes to every interview, but I saw Alexander Mattison in locker room cleanup day just say like, yeah, I'm not talking today. And I think it's because he didn't want to talk about what was a failed season all around. So you almost feel bad for a guy like that, because it's pretty clear early on that they're being asked to do something that they just cannot do. Yet he continues to be asked to do it. Add in the fact that your head coach doesn't really like running the ball at all, and it's just really not a good marriage.
And that is very unusual for Alexander Mattison to not be available, because
Hmm.
he is one of the more talkative athletes in the room. But you bring up the coach, and I think we have to ask that question as well. Now, we saw Ty Chandler average 4.5 yards per carry, so I think it's easy to point to that and say, "Hey, it's not like nobody did it." But also, the biggest game came from Ty Chandler against the worst running team, run defense in the NFL in Cincinnati. And Madison did have his moments. I mean, he was having a good game even when he got hurt against the Las Vegas Raiders. He played well against Chicago, and yet they didn't stick with the run in those games. They kept going back to the passing game, despite the fact that he was getting it together and having some success. There's also the question of the offensive line and blocking in general, where they have two great tackles at run blocking and a good center. But I think that the guards, a very important run blocking position, struggled quite a bit. So I don't think in any circumstance you can ever put it on just one player and one thing. And I also wonder about when Madison was at his best. He was a outside zone running back, which is what he was drafted for by the previous regime, to fit in with Kevin Stefanski and Gary Kubiak's style. And this team never really had a run identity. They ran something they like to call mid zone. There were a lot of duo runs, and then they would run some outside zone at times and had some success. But
Hmm.
I think that the lack of identity and maybe a different fit from where he had success before required a lot of reads, a lot of quick cuts, and maybe that wasn't the best fit for him with this coach that is more of a pass first, much more of a pass first, and a team that didn't do in the run scheme what he had done best in the past.
Yeah, and you would see like those games where it's like he looks good. Keep giving him the ball, and he would get a run for 3 yards, and it would be 2nd and 7, and you just knew it was going to be two passes in a row. So part of that, I guess, he was handcuffed by just the willingness to continue to run him. Maybe his numbers look a little bit better than 3.9 yards a carry if they stick with him in the games where he was rolling. But I think it really just boils down to when you saw the shift at the end of the year, when Ty Chandler was the lead back and Alexander Mattison was the backup again, they just looked different. And one guy looked like an NFL running back, and one guy looked like a guy who struggled to be an NFL running back. And I think that's really what it boils down to. There's just that level that he can't get to. Maybe if the thing gets inverted, maybe if he gets brought back and he is just kind of in a backup role, you'll start to see him thrive in the way he did when he was kind of spelling Dalvin Cook. But they just can't move forward with him as their one next year.
It's always difficult to know how a player is going to step into an increased role until they actually do it. And we did find out this year that it's not the best fit for Alexander Mattison going forward. And whether he comes back as a part of the team or not is unclear. But I think that he likely will, as paired with Ty Chandler, and the Vikings will probably also seek out another running back as well. We could also do a what happened to that guy on Kene Wongwu, but he's never had any chance. So I think we know that the coaching staff simply does not trust him either. So the Vikings will have to improve their running game significantly next year if they want to have a top-notch offense. All right, this was an episode of What Happened to That Guy. Look forward to our other parts of the series. Matthew Coller, Dane Mizutani. We'll catch you next time.